Welcome to this video where we're going to take a look at how we fetch data with SvelteKit and more importantly how we pass around that data from the backend to the front end. We're going to look at the page svelte files, at the server load functions, at the load functions between client side and backend, and how all that data works together. And we're going to do it with a very simple example. We're just going to imagine we have a blog and that blog has multiple articles, and depending on the article ID, we want to display different articles on the page. And for that, we're just going to create a new SvelteKit application by running npx sv create, and then we're just going to say data app, just like that. We want to have a minimal SvelteKit app. We want to use TypeScript. We don't need to add anything to the project, and we want to use npm. Cool. Now I'm going to go into my data app repository. I'm going to open it in Visual Studio Code. I'll just make this a little bit larger so you can see properly. And then in here, I'm going to open the terminal and just run npm I to install the dependencies. Perfect. And then run npm run dev to start the server. Now, before we start talking about how we handle data or how we pass data around our application, we first want to create the skeleton structure of our app, and for that we're just going to go into the routes directory here and we'll create a new folder called blog, and in blog we're going to create a new page.svelte file, which will be, and let's put this into an h2 tag, the entry point of the blog, just like that. Now, in order for us to reach that page, we also have to link to it, which right now we're not. So let's just go into +page.svelte and say we want to link here to the blog page, and we'll say go to blog. Great. Now, what we're going to do, because this is just a very small toy example, we're just going to imagine that we have two blog articles right here, and we'll just say here we have an href that links from the blog page to blog/0 for the first article, right? With 0 being the ID of that article. And then I just duplicate that here, say I want to link to blog/1, and that is our second article, just like that. Perfect. Now if I click on go to blog, we see this is the entry point of the blog, and then we have the first article and the second article. Perfect. Now the question is, where does the data come from? And usually now what we do is we want to have it come from an external data source, right? Somewhere else we store this information about the blog. We're not going to put it directly in the code, but instead we're reading it in from an external source. Now, anytime you're doing that in SvelteKit, you have to ask yourself a very, very important question, which is, how do we read that data in? And do I need any secret API keys or any other secrets in order for me to get that data? If yes, the only place we can run this data fetching procedure is on the server. Only if I have something that is publicly available, I want to run this potentially also on the front end, which we're going to look at later. So in our case, the answer to that question is we probably are okay with this being public data because it will be displayed on the blog anyway, but I just want to show you how it works if we actually fetch the data first server side. So how can we do that? Well, for every route that we have here, we are going to have a +page.svelte file, but also we can create server files and load functions which would just reside in +page.ts. So in our case, where do we want to actually have the data? Well, we need to have another route because this here is just the entry point. So what we're going to do is we're going to use dynamic routing and just say article ID here as the folder name. And in here then, we're going to have a page.svelte file. This is purely front-end. This is our markup. This is our HTML that we'll just display to the user. And in order for us to have a server load function, we're going to go and say +page.server.ts. And what we can do in here is we can create a function that is actually going to fetch that data for us. So I'm just going to say here I have a load function that I'm naming load, and this is going to be of type page server load, just like that. And this type here is going to have some kind of data coming in, which in our case is going to be an event, or is always going to be an event. And this event here is something that will have some information about this request, right? It will have the route parameters. It will tell us on which route this is actually running. And so in here, I can, for example, now just say I want to console log the event, and I want to return some data from this. And in my case here, I just want to return, this is an example blog post just like that. Now, what are we doing here? We're basically just saying whenever a user visits any article ID, like any route which goes blog/whatever, we want to say, let's look at the event here and just return the blog post right here. And now what happens is if I go back to my front end and I just refresh, we see that we have an event here. And this is all the information we are going to get, right? We're going to get the cookies, so we're going to get some information about the user potentially. And we also get the params right here, which in our case is the most important thing, because what we want to do is that anytime anybody goes onto any of these pages, right, whether I go blog 0 or blog 100, I want to get this request here, and then I want to use whatever param comes in here to then fetch my data. So in my case here, I can just go and say, I would like to get of the event, the request parameters, and I can just say here, I want to have the article ID come from the event.params object, just like that. And because Svelte is smart, or SvelteKit is smart, it knows that there will be an article ID attached to these params, because otherwise you would never even receive this request. Now, what we can do with this article ID is we can actually fetch some data from an external source. And in my case here, I'm just using a placeholder API that is looking like this. So JSON placeholder.typico.com post1, right, will give you this. So in our case here, I would like to use fetch, just like that, and then post it in. But instead of the number here at the end, I will obviously want to use my article ID just like that. And then I'm going to say I want to have a response right here. I have to await that. And now in order for me to see the response body like that, I'm going to have to say response.json like that and await that too. And now I can just log out the response body here. And when I do that and I clean up my terminal and we refresh here on our blog 100 page, we see here now we have user ID 10, ID 100, we have a title, and we have a body. So from that response body, I can now actually return something to the front end. So I'm just going to say here I have the title, which will be response body dot title, and we're also going to use the body, which we're going to say response body dot body like that. Now the question is, even if I get this data, how do I now access it on the front end? And the answer to that is very simple. In a SvelteKit app, we have a data flow coming from the backend to the front end. And in our case here, we have the page.server.ts file, and we just want to send whatever is being returned here to the front end. If we don't have a plus page.ts file, basically this moves directly to the front end. And how does it do that? We just have to go into our article ID file right here, have to say we want to write some JavaScript here, which I'm going to use TypeScript. And then I want to get the data that is being passed in here. And for that, in Svelte 5, you have the props rune like that. And we can just, for the start, say we want to get the data and just inspect that, which is another rune here, which will just show us whenever this data changes. So now, if we go to the front end again, and we open up the console right here, and we refresh, we see here now that we have a data value which has body and title. And maybe let's rename this and just say on our page server, we don't want to have a body, we want to have the blog article, just like that. But then what can I do here? Super simply, I can just go and say, well, I want to display an H1, and that is going to be here, my data.title. And now if I go to the front end here, you see at 100, it's whatever that is, that kind of title. And at 1, you see a different title, because every time we go to one of these blog articles, we're going to hit up the server right here with a different article ID, and it's going to return it just like we wanted. Okay, now in order for us to also display the body, we could go and do the same thing here, but actually it makes more sense for us to actually destructure the data of this. And then we can just say here we want to display the title, and then here as a p tag, we're going to say data.blog article. And the beautiful thing that you might have just seen now is we get full type safety because Svelte automatically understands the data flow from the server.ts file to the front end, and it knows that whatever is being returned here will be displayed or will be available here. So if I return a response, if I return a title and a blog article, then I have access to that right here. So if I say data.blog article, just like that, we see here that we get this of type any. Now we could improve on that, and we could say, okay, this we're going to type it here in the backend. Then you would also receive strings on the front end. Like for example, if I go and say this is not dynamic but just a string, you're going to see here that the blog article is now a string, right? Svelte understands that whatever data comes from here will then be present on the front end. So that is how you fetch data on the server. Now, before I said you always have to think whether you want to fetch something on the server side or something on the client or server side, right? So in this case here, our data is actually publicly accessible anyway, right? So we don't actually have to use an API key that is private that we have to hide away. So it might be a situation where we want to have a load function running also client side. But the question might be, why do I care? Why would I even run this client side? This all works. So why should we do that? Well, the answer to that is that this load function here can be a lot more performant because SvelteKit basically hydrates their site, meaning that it tries to anticipate the kind of data you're going to need, and it tries to minimize the number of server requests it actually has to make. So with this page.ts file, instead of me saying every time when I switch sites here, I have to go to the server, render that, I think it only starts at 1. Yeah, there we go. Every time I click on that, it has to go to the server has to make a request, it comes back to the front end with the markup. What we can do is we can actually say, and let's just go back to the blog article, the blog entry point here. We can actually say that whenever I click on these, I'm not going to make another server request. I'm going to handle this from the client side. So for that, we're going to do two things here. First of all, I'm going to go into my blog right here, so the entry point, and I'm just going to change this to 1 and 2. And then on my article ID, I'm just going to say instead of the page.server.ts file, I'm also going to have a page.ts file. And what I need to do here is very, very simple. I just copy everything from the page server load and say this is not a page server load function, but just a load function, just like this. Now I can get rid of this type in here. So with this load function, the main question is like, when does it actually run or how does it run? So I'm going to say here, this is our load function, and I'm going to add to our page server.ts file, this is our, well, actually let's do this completely different so that it gets highlighted more, server load function, just like that. And now you're going to see here our client-side console is empty, our server terminal is empty. Now the first thing here is if I now hover over the first article, you're going to see here, this is our load function. So something is being triggered, and that is happening client-side. On the other hand as well, it also triggers right now our server load function because Svelte anticipates a user clicking on potentially this article, so it tries to prefetch the data. Now, if I click on first article, we're going to see it actually doesn't have to reload it because it already knows it has fetched the data. And you also see that here, right? We have all the data available. Now, what happens if I actually remove this page.server.ts file right here? So now we don't have a server load function anymore. We only have a load function that either runs on the server or on the client. So let's go back to the main blog page, just like that. You see nothing is loading in the client side, nothing is loading on the server side. If I now click on first article, you see, or if I hover over first article, you see here it runs the load function client side, but nothing happens on the server side. And that is the main idea of this, right? So that's why this load function here could be more performant because it doesn't necessarily make server requests, right? If you're already on a SvelteKit app and you want to load something that has a load function right here, it will just do that client side and will preload that data and make it seem like a single page application, right? It preloads that data right for you. Now, on the other hand, if I go to the first article page just like that from a completely new window, this is automatically going to make a server request. So right here, you see our server load function is never run. But if I now make this request, you'll see we have this server side. So on the very first request, which has to be a server request, you'll see that even a load or page.ts file here is going to be triggered, right? Our normal load function is going to be triggered on the server. But then it also is going to rerun in the browser, right? That's just the point of those load functions. They either run server, either on the client. It depends on the environment from which they're being called. But no matter then what happens, whatever data is being fetched here can just be forwarded to the page.svelte file and can then easily be used in this fashion.